The early morning sun, stretching long shadows across Foggia's airfield in Italy, accompanied Captain Alejandro Torriani as he strode towards his Machi C-202 Folgore fighter. It was February 14th, 1944, and this 24-year-old ace had already etched 12 Allied aircraft into his combat tally above the Italian skies. His self-assurance was absolute, his gait unmistakable. After all, he was piloting one of Italy's most distinguished aerial machines, and he had just received intelligence concerning a new American aircraft that had him and his fellow pilots chuckling over their morning espresso. "Have you seen the photographic evidence of this new American pursuit craft?" Torri called out to his wingman, Lieutenant Marco Santini, who was diligently carrying out his pre-flight checks nearby. "They're calling it the Corsair. Just look at those wings, bent like a seagull's, and that immense nose. It appears they've strapped an engine onto a flying bathtub." Santini let out a chuckle as he examined the reconnaissance images that had been circulating amongst Italian aviators for weeks. The F4U Corsair, in truth, did seem ungainly when juxtaposed with the sleek, refined lines of their Machi fighters. Its signature inverted gull wings lent it an almost comical silhouette, while its colossal Pratt and Whitney radial engine protruded a nose so lengthy that pilots were incapable of seeing directly ahead during ground maneuvers. "The Americans have truly lost their senses," Santini responded, shaking his head in amusement. "How could anything so unlovely possibly perform well in the air? Our Folgore will easily outmaneuver this airborne brick." Little did these Italian pilots comprehend that they were on the precipice of encountering one of the most lethal fighter aircraft ever conceived. The F4U Corsair, despite its unconventional outward appearance, represented a technological marvel destined to revolutionize aerial combat in both the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters. Within mere hours, their mirth would transform into dread as they discovered that the awkward fledgling they had mocked was, in reality, a harbinger of death. The narrative of the F4U Corsair does not commence with its combat debut, but rather with an urgent demand for speed and ordnance that compelled American engineers to push the boundaries of possibility in 1940. Upon receiving the United States Navy's request for a novel carrier-based fighter, Chance Vaught faced specifications that seemed almost unattainable. The aircraft was required to surpass the speed of any existing aerial machine, possess sufficient firepower to neutralize enemy bombers, and still be adaptable for carrier deployment. Rex Beisel, Vaught's lead designer, confronted a fundamental quandary. To achieve the requisite velocity, he required the most potent engine available, the immense 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-280 Zero Double Wasp radial engine. However, this engine was of prodigious size, necessitating a propeller exceeding 13 feet in diameter to efficiently translate all that power into forward propulsion. Such a substantial propeller would inevitably contact the ground if fitted to a conventional fighter configuration. Beisel's ingenious solution was nothing short of revolutionary: the inverted gull wing design, which would ultimately become the Corsair's most defining characteristic. By angling the wings downwards from the fuselage and then upwards again towards the tips, he could position the landing gear within the lowest section of the wing. This provided adequate ground clearance for the enormous propeller, while maintaining relatively short and robust landing gear struts. The outcome was an aircraft that presented an unprecedented aesthetic. The F4U Corsair stood as a study in contradictions. Simultaneously beautiful and awkward, graceful in its aerial ballet, yet clumsy on the tarmac, gentle in the grasp of a seasoned aviator, but devastatingly lethal to those who underestimated its formidable capabilities. When the initial production Corsairs emerged from the assembly lines in 1942, they immediately established new benchmarks. The F4U became the inaugural American fighter to achieve a level flight speed exceeding 400 miles per hour, reaching a remarkable top speed of 417, thus eclipsing any operational fighter worldwide. Yet, speed was merely the genesis of the Corsair's array of advantages. The aircraft's offensive armament was, by any measure, devastating. 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns were strategically positioned within the wings, each capable of discharging 750 rounds per minute. When all 6 guns fired in unison, they generated a rate of fire potent enough to literally cleave enemy aircraft in twain. The 50 caliber projectiles were not merely numerous, they were substantial, each weighing nearly 2 ounces and traveling at speeds exceeding 1,800 feet per second. However, the Corsair's most crucial advantage could not be quantified by figures or specifications. It was constructed with exceptional resilience. The aircraft's structural integrity was massively over-engineered to withstand the stresses inherent in carrier operations, featuring a robust airframe capable of absorbing tremendous combat damage and continuing its flight. The pilot occupied an armored cockpit, shielded by bulletproof glass and steel plating, designed to deflect rifle rounds and shell fragments. This amalgamation of speed, firepower, and survivability established the F4U Corsair as a transformative instrument of war. Nevertheless, like many groundbreaking weaponry, it required time for its full potential to be actualized. Early Corsairs encountered a spectrum of issues that postponed their operational deployment. The aircraft proved challenging to land on carriers due to compromised visibility and intricate handling dynamics. The potent engine generated torque effects that could unexpectedly catch less experienced pilots off guard. Most critically, the Corsair exhibited a propensity for unannounced stalls, a characteristic that unfortunately proved fatal to several test pilots. These difficulties prompted the United States Navy to initially withhold approval of the Corsair for carrier operations, deeming it unsuitable for shipboard utilization. Consequently, the initial F4Us were assigned to Marine Corps squadrons operating from land-based airfields, where the aircraft's demanding characteristics were more manageable. This decision would prove prescient, as Marine pilots would ultimately be the first to unlock the Corsair's deadly efficacy. Meanwhile, within the Mediterranean theater, Italian aviators such as Captain Torriani continued to assert dominance in the skies with their Machi C-202 Folgore fighters. The Folgore was, indeed, a remarkable aircraft, swift, agile, and elegantly engineered. Propelled by a German Daimler-Benz engine, it could achieve speeds exceeding 307 miles per hour and ascend rapidly to high altitudes. In the hands of skilled Italian pilots, it had demonstrated ample capability to hold its own against Allied pursuit craft. The Italian Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica, had entered the Second World War with high aspirations and considerable expertise. Italian pilots were exceptionally well trained and seasoned, many having refined their skills during the Spanish Civil War. Their aircraft, though not as abundant as those of their adversaries, often surpassed them in design and performance. The Machi C-202, in particular, was regarded by numerous authorities as one of the finest fighters of its epoch. However, by the commencement of 1944, the situation had become increasingly dire for Italian aviation. The nation had capitulated to the Allies in September of 1943. Yet German forces had occupied northern Italy, establishing the Italian Social Republic under Mussolini's nominal authority. Italian pilots found themselves in an untenable predicament, fighting alongside their former German allies against the very forces with which their legitimate government had allied. This political turmoil had dire repercussions for Italian air power. A significant proportion of the most adept pilots had defected to the Allied side or simply ceased flying. Aircraft production had virtually halted, and spare parts grew increasingly scarce. The pilots who remained, such as Torriani and Santini, were operating aircraft that were frequently pieced together from salvaged components and powered by fuel of questionable quality. Notwithstanding these formidable obstacles, Italian pilots maintained their confidence and combat spirit. They possessed substantial grounds for optimism. Their Machi fighters had consistently outperformed Allied aircraft in aerial engagements, and they possessed an intimate knowledge of the local terrain. When intelligence reports began to surface regarding the new American Corsair fighter, they perceived no cause for alarm. The reconnaissance photographs appeared to validate their preconceptions. The F4U Corsair bore no resemblance to what a fighter aircraft ought to look like. Its warped wings seemed structurally unsound. Its prodigious nose suggested an inability to achieve forward visibility, and its overall proportions implied an aircraft conceived by a committee rather than by engineers conversant with the demands of aerial combat. Observe this contraption, Tory remarked to his squadron mates as they congregated around the intelligence photographs. "The Americans have exhausted all their innovative concepts." This resembles something a child would sketch if asked to design an airplane. How are we expected to take this seriously? The Italian pilot's confidence was entirely comprehensible. They had engaged Allied aircraft for years, developing effective strategies against each type. The P-51 Mustang was swift but delicate. The P-47 Thunderbolt was robust but heavy. The Spitfire was agile but possessed limited range. Each Allied fighter presented distinct strengths and vulnerabilities that experienced pilots could exploit. However, the F4U Corsair was an anomaly. It combined advantages that had hitherto been absent in a solitary aircraft. It surpassed the Mustang in speed, outmatched the Thunderbolt in resilience, and possessed superior armament compared to any fighter the Italians had previously encountered. Most crucially, it was piloted by individuals specifically trained to maximize its unique capabilities. The initial Marine Corsair squadrons had arrived in the Pacific in early 1943, and their preliminary experiences yielded mixed results. The aircraft's challenging handling characteristics had claimed several pilots during training, and early combat engagements had revealed both the Corsair's latent potential and its limitations. However, by the latter part of 1943, Marine pilots had devised tactics that capitalized on the Corsair's strengths while mitigating its weaknesses. The pivotal strategy involved eschewing turning contests, where the Corsair's weight and dimensions placed it at a disadvantage against more agile adversaries. Instead, Corsair pilots learned to leverage their aircraft's superior velocity and ascent rate to dictate the terms of engagement. They would plummet onto enemy formations from high altitudes, execute high-speed attack runs, and then ascend rapidly before the opposition could retaliate. This represented a novel form of aerial warfare that prioritized energy management over conventional dogfighting prowess. This tactical paradigm shift was poised to be implemented in the Mediterranean theater. In January of 1944, the first F4U Corsairs arrived at Allied airfields in Italy. They were piloted by seasoned Marine aviators who had honed their skills in the ferocious aerial conflicts over the Solomon Islands. These pilots brought not only superior aircraft, but also hard-won knowledge regarding their most effective utilization. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, the renowned Marine ace, had been among the initial individuals to recognize the Corsair's potential. "The F4U is not merely another fighter," he had impressed upon his pilots. "It is an entirely novel category of weapon. Discard everything you understand about dogfighting. This aircraft is engineered for destruction, not for elaborate maneuvers. Exploit its velocity, utilize its firepower, and never afford the enemy an equitable contest." This operational philosophy was about to be tested against some of the world's most accomplished aviators. Italian aces like Toriani possessed years of combat experience and an intimate understanding of their aircraft's performance parameters. They flew in familiar skies over terrain they knew intimately. They possessed every advantage save one. They had never confronted anything akin to the F4U Corsair. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter Italian confidence and demonstrate the groundbreaking nature of American aerial design. The pilots who had derided the Corsair's ungainly appearance were about to discover that in aerial combat, appearances could be fatally deceptive. As Captain Toriani concluded his pre-flight inspection and settled into the cockpit of his Machi C-202, he felt the familiar surge of confidence that had propelled him through dozens of successful combat sorties. His aircraft was a thoroughbred, responsive to his slightest touch and capable of maneuvers that would leave enemy pilots disoriented and defeated. He had no reason to suspect that this mission would deviate from the others. The intelligence briefing had been routine. Allied bombers were approaching from the south, escorted by the customary assortment of P-51s and P-47s. The new Corsair fighters were reportedly in the vicinity, but Toriani and his fellow pilots viewed them as curiosities rather than imminent threats. How formidable could an aircraft be if it appeared to have been designed by someone utterly unfamiliar with genuine fighter planes? As his Daimler-Benz engine roared to life and his propeller began to spin, Toriani felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, a sensation accompanying the few minutes he would be airborne, ascending towards another engagement with the enemy. He anticipated it to be like all the preceding missions, a test of skill and bravery that would culminate in another victory emblem painted on his aircraft's fuselage. What he did not anticipate was that he was on the verge of confronting an aircraft that would fundamentally alter his perceptions of aerial combat. The F4U Corsair transcended the category of merely another fighter. It was the harbinger of a new era in aerial warfare, one where traditional dogfighting paradigms would become as antiquated as the biplanes of the First World War. The Italian pilots who had scoffed at the Corsair's appearance were about to realize that its designers had prioritized lethality over aesthetics. Every element of the F4U's design had been optimized for a singular objective: the swift and efficient destruction of enemy aircraft. The inverted wings, which appeared so awkward, provided exceptional structural integrity and facilitated the installation of the massive landing gear necessary for carrier operations. The immense nose housed not only an engine, but the most powerful fighter engine in existence. Most significantly, its 6.50 caliber machine guns represented a quantum leap in fighter armament. Previous fighters typically carried 4 or fewer guns, often of a smaller caliber. The Corsair's 6.50 caliber weapons could unleash 4,500 rounds per minute of devastating firepower, sufficient to obliterate any aircraft within mere seconds. As Torriani taxied towards the runway, he was oblivious to the impending transformation of his world. The confident Italian ace who had derided the American flying bathtub was about to discover that he had been mocking his own impending demise. The F4U Corsair was approaching, and with it, a new chapter in the annals of aerial warfare would commence. The critical question was not whether the Corsair would prove its mettle in combat. Marine pilots in the Pacific had already definitively answered that query. The pertinent question was whether Italian aviators, irrespective of their skill or experience, could adapt with sufficient alacrity to survive their initial encounter with an aircraft that embodied the future of fighter design. As Torriani's Machi lifted off from the runway and ascended towards the morning sun, he was flying not merely towards another combat mission, but towards a rendezvous with history. The laughter that had echoed through the Italian ready rooms would soon be supplanted by a decidedly different sound: the distinctive whistle of .50 caliber machine gun rounds tearing through the Mediterranean sky. At 15,000 feet above the Italian countryside, Captain Torriani was the first to detect them, a formation of dark specks emerging from the southeast, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. His experienced eye immediately identified the bomber formation: 12B, 25 Mitchells, flying in a tight configuration, their twin engines emitting a steady drone as they approached their objective. However, it was the escorting fighters that captured his attention and brought a smile of anticipation to his face. "Contact, 2 o'clock high," Torriani radioed to his flight of 4 Machi fighters. "I count 8, no, 12 escort fighters. They appear distinct from the usual Mustangs." As the distance closed, the unmistakable silhouette of the F4U Corsairs became evident. Even from a distance, their inverted gull wings and massive noses rendered them instantly recognizable. Torriani experienced a surge of exhilaration mingled with amusement. At last, he would have the opportunity to test these much-discussed American fighters in actual combat. "Those must be the new Corsairs," Lieutenant Santini's voice crackled over the radio. "They're even more ungainly in person than in the photographs. Just look at those ridiculous wings." What the Italian pilots could not discern from their vantage point was the meticulous formation discipline of the approaching Corsairs. These were not the loose, undisciplined formations characteristic of early American fighter tactics. These Marines had learned their lessons in the crucible of Pacific combat, where a moment's inattention equated to certain death. They flew in tight, mutually supportive pairs, with each pilot continuously scanning the skies for threats while maintaining perfect alignment with his wingman. Major Robert "Cowboy" Cowan, leading the Corsair formation, had spotted the Italian fighters almost as soon as they appeared. Unlike the overconfident Italian aces, Cowan felt no amusement at the prospect of engagement. He had witnessed too many capable pilots perish due to underestimating their adversaries. However, he also possessed complete confidence in his F4US's capabilities and in his pilots' proficiency in exploiting their aircraft's inherent advantages. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high," Cowan announced calmly over the radio. "4 contacts, appears to be Mackies. Remember your briefing, gentlemen. We possess the speed and the firepower. Employ them." The unfolding tactical scenario was about to illuminate the fundamental divergence between traditional dogfighting and the novel energy-based tactics that the Corsair had enabled. The Italian pilots, adhering to conventional fighter doctrine, immediately commenced maneuvering to secure an advantageous position from which to initiate a turning engagement. They ascended slightly and fanned out, preparing to utilize their aircraft's superior agility to outmaneuver their opponents. Torriani's plan was textbook perfect for the era of 1940. He intended to lead his flight in a climbing turn that would position them above and behind the American formation, then dive for a classic deflection shot before executing a pull-up into a climbing turn that would compel the Americans to follow. Once engaged in a turning fight, the superior maneuverability of the Machi fighters would quickly prevail, rendering the clumsy American aircraft easy targets. However, Major Cowan harbored no intention of adhering to the established rules. Instead of turning to confront the Italian challenge, he executed a maneuver that defied every traditional tenet of fighter tactics. He completely disregarded the Italian fighters and maintained a direct course towards the bombers they were ostensibly protecting. "Stay with the bombers," Cowan instructed his pilots. "Let them come to us." This decision utterly bewildered the Italian pilots. In their experience, escort fighters invariably turned to engage attacking aircraft, abandoning their bombers to ensure their own survival. The fact that the Corsairs continued on their trajectory suggested either cowardice or incompetence. Torriani's confidence surged as he positioned his flight for what he anticipated would be an effortless attack on distracted opponents. "They're not even turning to engage us," Santini observed with astonishment. "These Americans have absolutely no fighting spirit." Torriani rolled his Machi into a steep dive, building velocity as he aligned his aircraft for his attack. The lead Corsair was perfectly framed within his gun sight, flying straight and level like a training dummy. At 400 yards, he squeezed the trigger, unleashing a stream of 12.7 millimeter projectiles towards the American fighter. What transpired next would be indelibly etched into Torriani's memory for the remainder of his life, however prolonged that might be. Instead of continuing its forward trajectory or attempting evasion, the Corsair abruptly executed a climb so precipitous and rapid that it seemed to defy the very laws of physics. The colossal Pratt and Whitney engine, generating an excess of 2,000 horsepower, propelled the fighter skyward at a rate that caused Torriani's bullets to trail harmlessly through empty air. In mere seconds, the Corsair ascended 2,000 feet, preparing for its retaliatory strike. "Madonna!" exclaimed Torri, his voice laced with disbelief as he witnessed the American warplane rocket away from him. His Machi, despite its commendable performance, simply couldn't contend with the sheer potency of the Corsair's colossal engine. By the time he had completed his dive and initiated his own climb, the American adversary was already above him, commencing its descent. Major Cowan's assault was a paragon of efficient energy deployment and marksmanship. He had leveraged his aircraft's superior power-to-weight ratio to transform the Italians' aggressive move into a defensive predicament, then unleashed the Corsair's annihilating armaments to conclude the engagement before it truly commenced. The sextet of 50 caliber machine guns unleashed their fury from a range of 300 yards. Their muzzle flares blazed like a deadly celestial arrangement. Each weapon discharged a phenomenal 750 rounds per minute, hurtling a torrent of heavy projectiles towards the Italian fighter at an astonishing velocity approaching 3,000 feet per second. The cumulative impact of this firepower was staggering, 4,500 rounds per minute of destructive force capable of obliterating any aircraft in an instant. Torriani felt his Machi convulse violently as the initial rounds found their mark. The 50 caliber projectiles were immense compared to the smaller caliber ammunition he was accustomed to facing. Each bullet, weighing nearly 2 ounces, possessed immense kinetic energy. Upon striking his aircraft, they didn't merely create perforations, they ripped away substantial portions of metal and structural components. The initial barrage, lasting a mere 2 seconds, proved catastrophic for the Italian fighter. Bullets tore through the engine, the cowling, severed oil lines, and punctured the cylinder heads. The cockpit canopy disintegrated in a hail of glass shards. The control cables for the rudder were severed, severely limiting Torriani's ability to maneuver. However, the most devastating consequence was the psychological shock. Toriani had never experienced such overwhelming firepower. The sound of the 50 caliber rounds impacting his aircraft was akin to being inside a colossal drum during a tempest. The vibrations were so intense that his vision blurred and his hands were jolted from the controls. "My God," he stammered into his radio. "What sort of weaponry is that?" The answer would have instilled even greater terror had he known it. The Browning M2050 caliber machine gun was the most formidable aircraft-mounted weapon of its kind globally. Originally conceived as an anti-tank weapon, its adaptation for aerial deployment proved devastatingly effective against both airborne and ground targets. Its ammunition was available in multiple configurations: armor-piercing, incendiary, and explosive, each engineered for maximum destructive impact. The Corsairs carried a composite load of all three types, forging a destructive cocktail that could penetrate armor, ignite fires, and literally dismember enemy aircraft. When all 6 guns fired in unison, they generated a cone of destruction from which survival was virtually impossible. Lieutenant Santini, observing his squadron leader's aircraft disintegrate under the onslaught of American guns, felt his confidence vanish like morning mist. The Corsairs' attack had been so swift, so devastating, that there had been no opportunity to react or retaliate. One moment, Tori was diving upon what seemed an easy target. The next, his aircraft was trailing smoke and debris as it plunged towards the earth. "Alejandro!" Santini called out urgently over the radio. "Alejandro, respond!" But Toriani was engaged in a desperate struggle for survival, desperately trying to regain control of his crippled fighter as it spiraled earthward. The Machi's engine was seizing, its oil pressure plummeting to zero as vital fluids leaked from numerous bullet impacts. The flight controls were sluggish and unresponsive, and he could detect the acrid scent of smoke beginning to permeate the cockpit. The Italian ace, who had started the day with unshakable self-assurance, now faced the grim prospect of death or capture. His magnificent Machi, the aircraft he had entrusted with his life through countless successful missions, was disintegrating around him, while the American fighter responsible was already ascending, seeking new targets among his remaining comrades. Major Cowan's tactical maneuver exemplified the Corsairs' groundbreaking approach to aerial combat. Rather than engaging in protracted dogfights, where pilot skill and aircraft agility were paramount, he had utilized his aircraft's superior performance to dictate the engagement's terms. The entire engagement, from initial contact to decisive conclusion, lasted less than 30 seconds. This represented the new paradigm of aerial warfare embodied by the Corsair. Speed, firepower, and energy management had supplanted traditional dogfighting prowess as the determinants of victory. The aircraft capable of the fastest climb, the steepest dive, and the most destructive payload delivered in the shortest time frame would reign supreme in the skies. The remaining Italian pilots were learning this harsh lesson through brutal experience. Santini, attempting to avenge his squadron leader, found himself in the same untenable situation that had doomed Toriani. As he maneuvered for an attack on one of the Corsairs, another American fighter descended upon him from above, its sextet of machine guns already chattering. The 50 caliber projectiles impacted Santini's Machi with the force of massive hammers. The initial salvo ripped through the engine cowling, destroying the supercharger and rupturing fuel lines. The subsequent burst swept up the fuselage, shattering the canopy and wounding Santini in the shoulder and leg. The third burst, fired as the Corsair flashed past at over 400 miles per hour, struck the wing root, severing the main spar. Santini's fighter disintegrated in midair, its wing buckling upward as structural failure propagated throughout the airframe. The young Italian pilot, bleeding profusely and semi-conscious, barely managed to eject before his aircraft erupted in a fiery inferno. The speed and decisiveness of the American assaults had shattered the Italian formation in under 2 minutes. 2 aircraft were lost, 1 pilot perished, and another was drifting towards the earth under a parachute. The remaining 2 Italian pilots, confronted by an adversary they could neither comprehend nor effectively counter, made the only logical choice available. They fled. Yet, even retreat offered no sanctuary from the Corsairs' devastating firepower. The American fighters, with their superior speed and climb rate, could pursue any aircraft they chose. The Italian pilots found themselves in the nightmarish scenario of being hunted by predators they could neither outrun, outclimb, nor outfight. The psychological impact of this encounter would resonate throughout Italian fighter squadrons for many months to follow. Pilots who had previously been confident in their skills and their aircraft suddenly faced an enemy that seemed to possess almost supernatural capabilities. The Corsair's amalgamation of speed, firepower, and resilience rendered it nearly invincible in the hands of adequately trained aviators. But perhaps most demoralizing was the dawning realization that this was not solely a matter of superior equipment. It represented a fundamentally altered philosophy of aerial warfare. The American pilots were not attempting to outmaneuver their opponents in conventional dogfights. Instead, they were exploiting their aircraft's inherent advantages to circumvent equitable engagements altogether, orchestrating scenarios where the outcome was predetermined by superior performance rather than sheer skill. This tactical evolution had been developing in the Pacific theater for over a year, as Marine Corsair pilots honed their ability to maximize their aircraft's unique attributes. The lessons acquired in battles over the Solomon Islands, Rabaul, and other Pacific battlegrounds were now being deployed with devastating efficacy against Axis air power in the Mediterranean. The Italian pilots who survived their initial encounters with the F4U Corsair returned to their bases with accounts that strained credulity. Aircraft capable of climbing like rockets, diving like meteors, and unleashing firepower that could obliterate any fighter in seconds. The seemingly ungainly, ugly duckling they had once derided was revealing itself to be the sky's deadliest predator. Word of the Corsair's formidable capabilities spread rapidly through Italian aviation circles, but this knowledge arrived too late to rescue countless pilots schooled in outdated combat doctrines. The traditional tactics that had served Italian aces so effectively against earlier Allied fighters were not merely ineffective against the Corsair, they were tantamount to suicide. Captain Torriani, should he have survived his forced landing, would never again mock an enemy aircraft based on its external appearance. The lesson he had learned at almost the cost of his life was one that would fundamentally reshape aerial combat for generations. In the arena of the skies, as in life, appearance is secondary to capability when the shooting begins. The F4U Corsair had announced its presence in the Mediterranean theater with devastating impact. The aircraft that Italian pilots had derided as a flying bathtub was proving to be the most lethal fighter in the sky, piloted by aviators who had mastered its revolutionary capabilities to redefine the very essence of air combat. Yet, this was merely the prelude. As more Corsair squadrons deployed to Italy and their pilots accumulated experience against European adversaries, the full magnitude of the aircraft's dominance would become undeniably clear. The laughter that had once echoed through Italian ready rooms would be replaced by a far more somber sound, the silence of pilots who had come to dread the distinctive whistle of the Corsair's approach. 3 weeks following his near-fatal encounter with the F4U Corsair, Captain Alejandro Torriani occupied a hospital bed in Rome, his left arm immobilized in a sling, his face still bearing the disfiguring scars from flying glass. He had survived his crash landing, but his former confidence had not. The man who had once scoffed at the Corsair's awkward silhouette now awakened in cold sweats, haunted by the phantom sound of 650 caliber machine guns tearing through the air. The experience of Italian pilots was being mirrored across airfields throughout northern Italy. As additional Corsair squadrons arrived and commenced systematic operations against Axis air power, the psychological toll proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Italian pilots who had once eagerly sought combat now manufactured pretexts to avoid missions where Corsairs might be encountered. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Cheney, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, reviewed the after-action reports with escalating concern. In the 3 weeks since the initial Corsair engagements, his group had suffered the loss of 18 aircraft and 12 pilots. The kill ratio was unprecedented. For every Corsair claimed destroyed, the Italians were losing 6 fighters. This rate of attrition threatened to decimate Italian air power within mere months. The men are calling it Il Diavolo Blu, the Blue Devil, Cheney informed his staff officers during a morning briefing. They claim the Corsair is invincible, that our fighters are no match for it. If we cannot restore their confidence, we will have no pilots left to fly. However, restoring confidence necessitated an understanding of what rendered the Corsair so overwhelmingly effective, and that comprehension was slow to materialize. Italian intelligence officers struggled to grasp how a single aircraft, could achieve such complete mastery of the skies. The accounts from surviving pilots bordered on the fantastical. Aircraft that could outclimb, outdive, and outgun anything in the Italian arsenal. The reality was that the F4U Corsair represented a quantum leap in fighter design, catching European aircraft manufacturers entirely off guard. While Italian, German, and British designers focused on refining existing concepts, American engineers embarked on a clean-sheet design, centering the aircraft around the most powerful engine available. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, which powered the Corsair, was a masterpiece of American engineering. With 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, it produced over 2,000 horsepower, exceeding the output of most bomber engines. This prodigious power plant endowed the Corsair with performance capabilities that seemed almost unbelievable to pilots accustomed to less potent fighters. Major Robert Cowan, the Marine pilot who had led the devastating assault on Torriani's formation, possessed an acute understanding of his aircraft's formidable effectiveness. In the ready room at Foggia Airfield, he briefed his pilots on the tactical tenets that had established the Corsair as the preeminent fighter in both the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters. "Gentlemen," Cowan explained to his squadron, "the F4U is not merely another fighter. It represents a revolution in aerial warfare. Every preceding fighter was conceived around the principle of dogfighting, turning, climbing, and maneuvering to gain an advantage over an opponent. The Corsair fundamentally alters this paradigm. We do not dogfight, we execute." The tactical doctrine developed by Marine pilots for the Corsair was predicated on energy management rather than conventional maneuvering. The aircraft's immense engine granted it the capacity to convert altitude into speed, and subsequently speed back into altitude with greater efficiency than any other fighter. This translated into Corsair pilots having control over the terms of every engagement, enabling them to choose when to fight and when to disengage. "Our advantage is not merely speed or firepower," Cowan continued. "It is the ability to dictate the engagement. We engage when we hold the advantage, and we disengage when we do not. The enemy cannot compel us into a fair fight because we are consistently faster, possess a superior climb rate, and are always capable of evading if circumstances turn unfavorable." This tactical flexibility was demonstrated daily as Corsair squadrons initiated systematic operations, targeting Italian airfields and aircraft manufacturing facilities. Unlike earlier Allied fighters, which relied on numerical superiority or tactical surprise, the Corsairs could approach even heavily defended objectives with unwavering confidence. Their speed rendered them exceedingly difficult to intercept, their firepower made them lethal to any aircraft they encountered, and their inherent robustness allowed them to withstand damage that would have incapacitated other fighters. The psychological warfare aspect of Corsair operations proved as significant as their material impact. Italian pilots began reporting Corsair sightings, even in the absence of actual F4Us in the vicinity. The distinctive resonance of the aircraft's engine, a deep, guttural roar unlike any other fighter, became a source of dread for Axis pilots throughout the Mediterranean. Flight Sergeant Mario Bellegamba, a veteran Italian pilot with 15 confirmed victories, chronicled the psychological toll in his personal diary. "Today, we scrambled to intercept bombers over Florence. As we climbed to altitude, someone reported Corsairs in the area. Immediately, the formation began to disperse, pilots casting nervous glances over their shoulders. We never encountered a single Corsair, yet the mission was compromised. How can we combat an enemy that defeats us merely by its existence?" The Corsair's formidable reputation was further amplified by its extraordinary survivability. Unlike earlier Allied fighters, which could be downed by relatively minor damage, the F4U could absorb tremendous punishment and continue in combat. The aircraft's structure was exceptionally over-engineered to withstand the stresses of carrier operations, a robustness that translated into exceptional tolerance for battle damage. Marine Captain James Zeke Civoli returned from a mission over Rome with his Corsair riddled with perforations from German 20mm cannon fire. The aircraft had sustained hits to its engine, wings, and fuselage, yet it continued to fly with remarkable stability. "Any other fighter would have gone down," Cavalli reported. "The F4U just kept flying as if nothing had happened. It's not just a fighter, it's a flying tank." This resilience was pivotal to the Corsair's psychological impact. Italian pilots who managed to inflict damage upon the American fighters watched in dismay as their targets continued their flight, seemingly unfazed by damage that would have annihilated their own aircraft. The realization that even successful attacks might not bring down a Corsair added another layer of demoralization to an already dire situation. The technological superiority of the Corsair was complemented by the caliber of its pilots. The Marine aviators flying F4US in the Mediterranean were veterans of the Pacific Campaign, where they had honed their skills in some of the war's most brutal aerial engagements. They brought not only superior aircraft, but also hard-won tactical knowledge and an unshakable confidence in their abilities. These pilots had confronted the finest the Japanese had to offer, including the legendary Zero fighters and their skilled pilots, and had emerged victorious. The Italian fighters they now encountered, though well-designed and flown by courageous men, simply could not match the amalgamation of experience and equipment that the Marine Corsair squadrons represented. The industrial might that produced the Corsair was as critical as the aircraft itself. While Italian aircraft production was hampered by material shortages, aerial bombardments, and political instability, American factories were churning out F-4s at an astonishing rate. Chance Vough's production lines were delivering over 400 Corsairs per month by early 1944, with additional aircraft manufactured by Goodyear and Brewster under license. This production capacity ensured that Corsair losses could be swiftly replaced, while Italian fighter strength continued its inexorable decline. Every Italian pilot shot down represented an irretrievable loss of expertise and training. Every Corsair lost was replenished within days by a new aircraft piloted by another seasoned aviator. The strategic ramifications of Corsair dominance became starkly evident as Italian air resistance crumbled throughout the spring of 1944. Allied bombers, shielded by Corsair escorts, commenced operations over Italy with virtual impunity. Italian aircraft factories, already struggling with material scarcity, were systematically dismantled. The remaining Italian fighter squadrons were compelled to adopt increasingly defensive postures, conserving their dwindling assets for the most critical missions. Captain Torriani, recuperating from his injuries and reflecting upon his encounter with the Corsair, began to comprehend the broader implications of his experience. In his diary, he penned, "We have been fighting the previous war while the Americans have been preparing for the next. Our beautiful Machis were designed for the aerial warfare of 1940, but the Corsair represents 1950. We are not merely outmatched, we are obsolete." This sobering realization was permeating the Italian Air Force as more pilots encountered the devastating efficacy of the F4U. The aircraft that had been dismissed as aesthetically unappealing and awkward was proving to be the world's most advanced fighter, incorporating design principles and manufacturing techniques years ahead of European practices. The Corsair's inverted gull wing, which had initially appeared so unconventional to Italian observers, was, in fact, a triumph of engineering, enabling the aircraft to meld the advantages of a large, powerful engine with the structural demands of carrier operations. The massive nose, which had struck some as comical, housed not only an engine but the most sophisticated power plant in aviation, complete with advanced supercharging and fuel injection systems. Most critically, the .650 caliber machine guns that had shredded Torriani's fighter signified a fundamental paradigm shift in fighter armament philosophy. While European designers had prioritized lighter, faster-firing cannons, American engineers opted to maximize the destructive impact of each projectile. The result was a weapon system capable of destroying any aircraft with a single, concentrated burst. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the impact of Corsair operations extended far beyond the immediate tactical landscape. The psychological ascendancy of the F4U was eroding the resolve of Italian pilots to continue the fight. Morale plummeted as news of the American fighters' invincibility spread. Skilled aviators started petitioning for assignments to ground duties or vanished entirely, unwilling to confront an adversary they deemed unconquerable. The scarce Italian flying aces who persisted in taking to the skies developed novel strategies, meticulously devised to circumvent any encounters with the Corsair. They would launch assaults solely when assured of the absence of any F4U units in the vicinity, and would disengage instantaneously upon perceiving the slightest indication of the distinctive American warplane. While these protective maneuvers managed to preserve some Italian aircraft, they also effectively rendered the Italian air arm incapable of posing a significant threat within the Mediterranean theater. By September of 1944, a mere 8 months after the initial engagements with the Corsair, organized Italian aerial opposition had all but evaporated. The few remaining fighter squadrons were diminished to mere symbolic contingents, their pilots disheartened and their aircraft severely depleted. The Regia Aeronautica, which had commenced hostilities as a proud and proficient force, had been systematically decimated by an adversary representing a new paradigm in aerial combat. The enduring impact of the Corsair's supremacy in the Mediterranean extended well beyond the conclusion of the Second World War. The strategic principles pioneered by naval aviators, encompassing energy conservation, superior offensive power, and technological advancement, would lay the groundwork for the tactical approaches of the jet propulsion era. The F4U had conclusively demonstrated that, in contemporary aerial conflict, the aircraft possessing the optimal confluence of velocity, armament, and resilience would inevitably dominate, irrespective of the pilot's proficiency or conventional strategic considerations. For the Italian pilots who had initially scoffed at the Corsair's peculiar appearance, the realization arrived far too late, and at an exorbitant price. Captain Torriani, permanently sidelined from flying due to his injuries, would spend the remainder of his existence recalling the thunderous barrage of those 650 caliber machine guns and the annihilating efficacy of the machine he had once derided as a flying bathtub. The F4U Corsair had definitively established that, in the arena of warfare, much like in life, outward appearances can be profoundly and perilously misleading. The aircraft that appeared ungainly and cumbersome had fundamentally reshaped aerial engagements, introducing novel concepts and capabilities that would influence fighter aircraft designed for many years to come. The aviators who had mocked its unusual bent wings and substantial fuselage had learned in the most unforgiving manner possible that the future of aerial warfare belonged not to the aesthetically pleasing machines, but to the most lethal. The merriment that had once reverberated through Italian briefing rooms in early 1944 had been supplanted by a profound quietude, a silence accompanying the approach of the Corsair, and the eternal stillness of those who had comprehended too late that the Blue Devil was no matter for jest. The F4U had heralded the dawn of a new epoch in aerial conflict, one where technological superiority and inventive tactics would triumph over ingrained tradition and accumulated experience. Ultimately, the Italian pilot's initial reaction to the Corsair, though understandable, proved disastrous. They had assessed the aircraft based on its looks rather than its inherent capabilities, a misjudgment that cost them their air force and, for many, their very lives. The F4U Corsair had imparted a vital lesson to the world, one that would echo through the jet age and beyond. In the grim and consequential pursuit of aerial combat, outward appearance holds no weight. What truly matters is the effectiveness with which one can obliterate the enemy when the engagement commences.